Hello, everyone. My name is Ben, and I teach people about the anatomy of lifting. Today, we're going to go over the differences between rows and pull downs because both rows and pull downs will train the back, but they do slightly different things in terms of which muscles they recruit the most. And just so that you can be more specific to those muscles, I'm going to go over in detail today the anatomy of the differences between the rows and the pull downs that you commonly are probably doing in your training split in the gym. So, first things first, we really need to start to dissect the basic physics of exercise before we even begin to discuss the specifics of the muscular anatomy. Because the basic physics and specifically direction of resistance relative to where our bodies are moving is really ultimately what determines what happens in any exercise, right? Muscle contraction is a response to the resistance against which we are moving. So here I have an image basically just of a normal person where they're raising their arm through this spectrum of being down at their side to being overhead. And really, the starting position of any row or any pull down will more than likely fall somewhere in between this range, meaning that it could be at 0, but it could be slightly higher, it could be at 90 degrees, it could be at 120 degrees. But regardless of which of these positions you find yourself in, whether you're doing a row or a pull down, you're probably somewhere along this spectrum. And so the way that we can start to conceptualize this is based upon the direction of resistance that is acting against us. So let's imagine that we're doing a row. What is the typical direction of resistance of a row? Obviously, there are differences between the specific machine that you're using or using dumbbells or cables. But right now, from a first principles overview standpoint, what is that thing trying to do to your arm? Well, effectively, it is trying to pull your arm forward off of your body, right? If the resistance could win the whole battle, what it would ultimately do is it would tug your arm forward off of your body. Now, thankfully, if you're a normal, healthy human being, that doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is because we create muscle tension to resist that from happening. So the next question, and this is a sort of stepwise process that you can do for any of these motions, is basically just to ask, okay, what would happen from a muscle standpoint? What would need to happen from a muscle standpoint for my arm not to get pulled off of my body forward? And the reality is that we would need to create what I have designated with a blue arrow here, some kind of contraction, some kind of tension against which we can create motion and force against the direction of resistance. Again, so on all these different slides here, red will represent the resistance and what it's trying to do to our hand and subsequently our upper arm and our shoulder girdle. And then the blue will represent the muscular contraction in opposition to that force. So with that in mind, let's just go over the exact thing we just did with the spectrum of raising the arm up and down. And then imagine what would happen in the various positions as we went through a row or a pull down. So imagine my arm goes here. What is the resistance likely doing in that particular case? It's pulling my arm up in this way. So muscles, whichever ones they may be, which we'll go over in a little bit, need to contract and resist that direction that way. What if I have my arm a little bit lower? What if the direction of resistance is sort of pulling me again parallel to the arm in that direction downward? And what if I'm rowing my elbow up and back sort of against it? Well, again, I would need muscles that sort of act equal and opposite to that direction. Same thing for something that's more of like a pull down motion. Again, that red representing the line of resistance, that blue representing the line of contraction. And then same thing for the sort of inverse or opposite of that, meaning, this might be something like a shrug where your arms are slightly forward in front of your body, right? Where the arm is getting pulled downward toward the floor, against which you have to create that that blue line of contraction. So if I take this particular instance, and again, we'll go over different examples on my skeleton model here in a little bit, but if I were to just sort of layer on some additional detail with specifics in just sort of an anatomy imagery, what would that look like, right? Well, I would know that based upon this blue arrow right here, that these blue arrows and these things here, in other words, the upper traps, which would be sort of represented by this line here, the middle traps, which would be represented by this line here, and then also the rear delts, if you can imagine, as the arm starts to bend. These are all the things that are going to pull the arm upward and backward against what? This direction of resistance in red. So the summary here, and we'll go over just a couple more examples before we move to the skeleton model, is identify the direction of resistance, number one. That's the first thing you need to do. Number two is ask yourself, what is happening to my joints? What is happening to my bones? In what direction are my bones getting pulled? And then number three is, what is the muscular contraction that needs to occur in response to those bones being pulled in those given directions? Here's another example. Again, if someone is doing a pull down, right, their arm is maybe slightly in front of their body. Again, red is the direction of resistance being pulled up. Blue is the opposite, again, that muscle contraction response. And I just chose one of multiple muscles that would be contributing to this, right? This blue arrow here sort of represents the lower portions of the lats pulling the arm down. This other blue arrow, which is not pictured, might represent something like the teres major, which would also pull the arm down from this position. And of course, other associated tissues, potentially the rear delt. Obviously, the upper portions of the lats can still contribute. If my arm is bending on the way down, the muscles that bend my elbow could also contribute, right? But overall, hopefully these concepts are starting to become more clear. Here's just one more example again of that first one that we talked about. Okay, my arm is getting pulled forward and sort of off of my body in that direction. Which tissues might contribute to resisting that from happening? Well, the traps, the rhomboids, which aren't pictured here, right? Which is, I'm trying to represent with this arrow. The upper portions of the lats specifically, because they act, again, more equal and opposite to this direction than the lower portions of the lats, although they will still contribute. Something like the rear delt, which is not pictured here, but which would pull sort of in that same direction, right? So all these things sort of hearkening back to the same principles of resistance first, what is happening to my bones as a consequence of that, and then what prevents my bones from getting pulled in those directions. So now let's look at an actual demonstration of me sort of moving my skeleton around, and I'm going to talk through basically all the different kinds of pull downs and rows, and using these first principles, discuss what the muscle recruitment as a consequence of those positions and those motions will be. So now that we have a solid understanding of the first principles of what might underlie the eventual muscle contraction, let's sort of talk through that whole sort of spectrum of pulls that we were just discussing. So starting from the bottom up, if my arm is getting pulled straight down to the floor again, start from that first principle thing. Where is my arm getting pulled? What is happening to my shoulder girdle as a consequence of that? If I'm doing something like a shrug, many of you intuitively know, hey, shrugs equals traps. Cool. But why? Well, if a shrug is pulling my shoulder girdle downward, what is happening is this bone, and this bone are all getting pulled toward the floor. And so if I'm going to pull up against it with just my shoulder girdle, well, what are the muscles that do that, right? The muscles that basically run from here and go upward. So my upper traps, which attach to my clavicle and run up into my neck, my middle traps, which attach from here and run into my spine, my levator scap, which basically attaches to this end of the triangle and runs up in this direction. Those are going to be the main movers which contribute to this kind of a thing. What happens now though, if I do that and maybe I do something like not that quite a shrug, but something more like a shrug row, well, all of this recruitment would remain the same because the scapula still needs to move upward, but what will pull the upper arm up in this direction is something like the rear delt, right, which by the resistance would be getting pulled sort of this way. The rear delt running from the scapular spine down into the arm here would converge these 2 points together, okay? So something low to high, upper traps, middle traps, levator scap, rear delt, check. What if I do something kind of in the middle, okay? And so my arm is not just getting pulled forward, right? My arm being this bone here, but my whole shoulder girdle, right? In other words, this bone, and this bone all together are getting pulled in that direction. What do you sort of see happening? And I know I don't have every sort of muscle division listed here, but what happens if my arm gets pulled in this direction, right? Well, all the muscles which would pull the whole shoulder girdle and the arm backward like this need to contribute, in addition to the muscles that would create this kind of motion here of this bone pivoting backward. So we're not talking about the elbow muscles. This is not an elbow muscle video, right? But just in terms of the shoulder contribution here, which muscles, again, back to that first principles question, which muscles would prevent my shoulder girdle from getting slid off of my body this way? Well, obviously all of the lats would contribute to preventing that from happening because all of the lats attach from various portions on the spine and the hips and they run up into the upper arm. And so specifically in this direction, right, the ones that run most horizontally would be the ones to contribute most. So if I had to pick a portion of the lats, which would contribute most to a sort of row that looked like this, pulling the arm backward, it would be these red guys here as represented as the ones that run a little bit more horizontally. Why? Because the arm is getting pulled horizontally. So horizontal arm getting pulled direction thing, upper lats, okay? And we'll discuss the whole lower lat thing in just a second. And then in addition to that, what are some other muscles that contribute to this motion of the shoulder girdle backward? Well, the rhomboids, which pull the shoulder girdle this way, right? So they would get stretched by this, and the rhomboids attaching from inside of the scapula to the spine, they would pull these 2 points together, in addition to a combination of all the different traps. So row, somewhere in the middle, arm getting pulled forward. We have a ton of recruitment from the traps, the rhomboids, the lats, and then also we could potentially make the argument for some rear delt, depending on where you direct the arm, and then teres major, which attaches to these 2 points and brings these together. And then lastly, let's discuss the overhead sort of a motion, right? And a pull down sort of a motion, same exact questions, same exact process. What muscles resist this from happening or resist our shoulder girdle getting pulled upward toward the ceiling and off of the body that way? Well, the ones that run parallel and opposite to that direction would probably do the most amount of work. So a vast majority of your pull down variations, they're gonna target the lower lats, definitely substantially, okay? So in addition, obviously the other portions of the lats will be involved, but because these run most vertical and resist this motion the most, those are gonna be the ones that have the greatest contribution. And like the rows, potentially the teres major as well as the rear delts will be substantially involved. Now, what I would say is this. Once you have gone through all those first principles, you need to start to understand more specifics about, okay, well, if I direct my arms slightly wider or slightly more narrow, what starts to happen? But ultimately, the process for going through those things is the same, right? You look at the position, you identify where is the resistance pulling the arm in this position, and then you work backwards from there to identify the muscle contraction and what would be contributing the most. So, just for example, if you were to do a row, right? Again, at that 90-degree angle where we established, okay, rhomboids, traps, lats, teres major, rear delt, all contributing, but maybe you did two different variations of that row. So maybe one of the rows happened or occurs where you sort of row tight to your body, and then another version of the row sort of occurs where you row outward this way. Well, if you have to identify the distinction between those two things, you just go through the same process, okay? So if my arm is getting pulled forward here, the end range position is the same, right? Meaning that whether I'm going to go wide or I'm going to go narrow, this end range position is the same, mostly lats and traps to manage this position just because the arm is getting pulled forward. Right? But what starts to happen is if I pull my arm downward, what you'll notice from this particular angle is that these lats, because they run nice and tight to the body off of the rib cage, right? You can see them right here. They will manage that narrower motion more substantially. And what will happen is if I pull my arm forward and wide, you all see now how these lats are actually pulling sort of at this downward angle. So a more lat specific row might be a row in which I come narrow to my body, and a more upper back specific row might be a row where I actually come wider out to the side. Why? Well, because if I come wide out to the side, do these things actually contribute to pulling the arm backward? Not really, especially in this position. But what does still have the ability to pull backward? The rear delts, right? In addition to all these things that we discussed before, traps and rhomboids to manage that position, okay? So the principle-based takeaway is this, again, just to harken back to sort of the first principles things, identify that direction of resistance, ask yourself, where is the arm and the shoulder being pulled, and then what muscles pull equal and opposite to the direction of resistance. That's a really foolproof way to identify a contraction in any kind of row and any kind of pull down, not to mention any kind of exercise in general.
If you like this content and you want to learn more from me, you definitely need to check out the Modern Meathead community. Inside the community, you'll get direct access to me for one-on-one personalized feedback. In addition, you'll get access to hundreds of hours of premium content exclusive to members only. When you get inside the community, you'll get direct access to all these different features. Now, I make daily posts covering different exercises where I post videos of exercises directly, the anatomy of those exercises, and very specific breakdowns relative to whatever the goals of that exercise are. In addition, members are posting things every day with comments and questions of their own. And what you can see is as we go through all of these different kinds of posts, I respond to everything, every question, every comment directly, and I'll give direct feedback in the comment sections to all the different exercise variations you post. In addition, when you look over to the left side of your community, we have all these different community forums, but you'll also get access to all these different courses that I have on biomechanics, programming, pain-free training, as well as coaching and cueing. And when you click into the course, you'll see your videos on the left and then all the different other videos of the course on the right side. In addition, you'll also get access to an exercise library where I'm constantly adding new exercises, basically everything that I film in the gym with step-by-step tutorials. You'll also get access to previous Q&A recordings that I do on Instagram and live in the community, as well as all these other specific member lectures, which can last from 30 minutes to an hour every single week. You also get access to premium articles, ebooks, and all of my training programs with just one subscription. So if you want to learn more about the anatomy of lifting and a community of like-minded individuals who are all lifting obsessed, you can start your 7-day free trial, zero risk subscription today.